What can you do about complex graphics? They're hard enough to understand in a report. In a presentation, they're a real challenge. The most common advice is to simplify. Simplification is good to the extent it is possible, but you certainly don't want to dumb it down. You don't want to eliminate critical elements just because you think your audience won't understand. I'm going to suggest 3 strategies. First, make your graphic pictorial where you can. Also, look for any structure you can highlight to help your audience grasp the ideas. Finally, build the figure piece by piece, explaining it as you go. Before I get into that, I will reflect on something I did in my video on structure. Recall that I showed a structure for a bicycle safety presentation. My final graphic in that illustration had quite a lot of detail, but I built up to it in a series of slides, starting with very little detail and then adding a little more detail in every slide. Also recall that I said I should be able to use the same strategy for any other presentation, and I offered another illustration that laid out my approach to developing and then delivering a presentation. I gave all of that diagram to you in one hit. Reflect for a moment on how you felt when you saw that second diagram. When I'm in the audience and I see someone put up something like that, I reel back mentally. I think, phew, that's a lot to take in. Then I try to work my way through it. So, this points to one of my strategies. If I have a diagram with a lot of detail, I add the detail incrementally and talk through the detail as I'm adding it. When you're in the audience, you should be able to read a graphic, but when it's complex and it comes at you all at once, that can be difficult. And there's another advantage for you as presenter for doing it this way. If you go back to that earlier video, you might notice that I did much better working through the narrative for the bicycle safety structure than I did for the presentation structure. The incremental strategy really helps you work through the details of your narrative step by step. I also do a couple of other things with complex diagrams, but before I get into those, I will show you this diagram. It's from a report commissioned by one of the major political parties in Australia. The report, titled An Agenda for a Knowledge Nation, argued that to prosper in the 21st century, Australia needs to rely less on natural resources and more on intellectual resources. It's a sensible argument, but this diagram, presented very early in the report, diverted attention from the important issues. It prompted a leading member of the opposing party to say something like, they want Australia to be a noodle nation. My feeling is that whoever did this brainstormed the content and then constructed the figure without much thought about what they wanted their readers to take from it. These sorts of node and link diagrams are popular in the knowledge professions, but they are often difficult to read. Now, before I leave this diagram, I want to point to something. These two concepts, government and manufacturing and construction, seem to be more general than most of the other concepts. Possibly, they form a central axis, structuring the diagram, separating the right half from the left half. And this one on the right, trade and commerce, also seems to be a more general concept. Does it also contribute to a hidden structure in this diagram? So now, getting into the more general argument, when I introduce something like this, How do I go about it? I do three things. I use informative graphics where I can. I also foreground the underlying structure of the ideas behind the diagram. Finally, I build the figure piece by piece, explaining it as I go. Let's return to that knowledge nation diagram. I've tidied it up a little, but even so, it's still difficult to see what it means. One part of the problem is that those nodes are all similar, being distinguished only by their labels. It's almost always challenging to distinguish the different nodes of a complicated node and link diagram, and to develop a good sense of the full meaning of each node. So one thing I will do is insert images where I can. For that knowledge nation node, I might, for example, insert an image of Australia. That would do a much better job of helping an audience tune into the implicit meanings associated with that node. It would also help members of an audience find that knowledge nation node more easily among all other nodes. In addition, an image is far more memorable, and you do want your audience to remember what you say. An explicit structure can also help your audience understand your graphic. This is the sort of structure I see in that knowledge nation diagram. 4 quadrants defined by government, trade and commerce, manufacturing and construction, and national agenda. These are the 4 entities that must be strong if Australia is to grow as a knowledge nation. I would then name the quadrants as I illustrate here: government services, industry, commercial services, and national institutions, to ensure everybody understands the nature of the content of each quadrant and how it is different to the content of other quadrants. Then I would start building the details, working through the quadrants, inserting pictorial representations of the entities, and inserting the desired links. For example, in this upper right quadrant, I have public health, social services, immigration, and environment. I show interactions where relevant. For example, a robust public health department will benefit social services, while a robust social services department will benefit public health. I also show the contributions to Australia as a knowledge nation via the entities that define the quadrants. For example, both social services and public health strengthen Australia through government action, while environment strengthens Australia through benefits to manufacturing and construction. I would work through this quadrant by quadrant, building up the explanation as I go. The industry quadrant plus relationships. The commercial services quadrant plus relationships. And finally, the national institutions quadrant plus relationships. So, to summarize what I've done here, I've used pictures to represent entities wherever possible, enriching the semantics, moving away from that impoverished representation of generic nodes and cryptic labels. Then I built this up in layers, emphasizing the underlying structure where I could and filling in the details section by section. I have a few more thoughts on how to present complex graphics in my book, Presentations for the Knowledge Professions. But if you follow the strategies I have outlined here, your audience should be able to follow your ideas with far less effort.